I would like to thank our many sponsors who made this dinner and, quite frankly, the Pearson Center possible. We have some sustaining sponsors who support us all throughout the year. Those include AMAPCO, the CBTU Union, TikTok Canada, and Faskins. Those are our sustaining sponsors. Also, we have a new media sponsor that's a sustaining sponsor, and that's Spark, North Star, and National News Watch, which is why you saw a wonderful op-ed on National News Watch today. So thank you, Laura, for organizing that. Our platinum sponsors are Bruce Power and Sandstone Group. Our silver sponsor is PAA, and our bronze sponsor is the Royal Bank. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Irwin and David, and I'll let you just take it.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup ce soir. C'est un grand honneur pour moi, évidemment, d'être ici avec vous. Donc, je voudrais remercier Pam Damoff et Kevin et le Centre Pearson et Irwin aussi de m'avoir accordé ce privilège. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I had a picture I wanted to put up. I don't know if you guys have the slide. There we are. So this is when Irwin got his honorary doctorate at McGill University, and this was prior to the ceremony. And Irwin and I were chatting because I was part of the platform party, and it's important that you see the structure of the picture. It was a wonderful day for Irwin, and of course he was fantastic giving the commencement address to the graduating class of the Faculty of Law of 2019. But you'll see Irwin pointing at me with his fingers. When I put this up on social media, Howard Liebman is here. Howard wrote me almost immediately and said, David, how many points did he have for you? Did he have 7? I think Howard, I think he had more than that. So, and I can tell you that when I became Minister of Justice, I'll go into this in a second, I would speak to Irwin at least once or twice a year, and Irwin would always have 7, 8, 9 points that he would want to run through. Never any notes, right? Never any notes, but he would run through the whole thing, and you would be mentally exhausted by the end of it. I just wanted to thank Irwin for that. The challenge this evening is to present to you a national treasure and an international treasure. There is really nobody, perhaps on the planet, who has done more for the advancement of international human rights. Who has done more to combat hate and racism, who has done more to identify and fight the tragic and dramatic rise in antisemitism, who has done more to talk about accountability of government. And so it's an honor for me. Irwin taught me. Carrie Buck is here in the room. We were in that constitutional law class way back. Carrie was younger than us. And then he became my colleague when I first started at McGill, and was one of the people that pushed to help me get hired as a tenure-track professor, and was one of the first calls I made in 2019 when I got named Minister of Justice. And Irwin, thank you. We spoke on the phone that day, and I asked, well, Irwin, what would you do? And one of the things that he did tell me, and I'm looking at Harry Laforme, said, David, if you have the runway, try to get the wrongful conviction structure set up. And we finally accomplished that. Harry played a role, and I'm pleased that we did. So tonight, I'm going to ask Irwin some questions. Irwin is going to elaborate, and I hope by the end of it, you will have gotten to know him better. So let me begin, Irwin, by welcoming you and saying, what are you doing now? Because not everybody knows. Where are you, and what are you working on?
Well, I promise I won't start with 10 points. My son, who's here, knew the story of the 10 points, and he would say to me, Dad, it's a new generation now. After 2 points, we're gone. So only. So I'm happily engaged now in the Ralph Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which I founded after leaving Parliament. And the best thing about it, David, is the young people who inspire it, run it, underpin it, who are here this evening. They really are the fulcrum, the underpinning, the inspiration. I get, my energy and inspiration from them. And like you and other of my former students here, and I don't like to use that word in any paternalistic way, all I can say is I am your beneficiary. And it's my former students who've become my teachers, and you are one of them.
Thank you, Irwin. Um, like you, we were in a great law faculty, and we were inspired by our students, and we're continued to inspire by the people that we work with. And if you've read the Pearson Center introduction, you'll know that Irwin was inspired by his parents who taught him about justice and injustice. But there were others too, Irwin. Who else out there inspired you along the way?
Well, you did mention, my parents of blessed memory, and I have to say that they were my first teachers, mentors. I've said this before, but for me it always bears remembrance and repetition. It was my father who taught me when I was still too young to understand the profundity of the message, when he said to me that the pursuit of justice, as he put it, was equal to all the other commandments combined. And then he said, this must be your mission in life. This is what you must teach onto your children. But I have to say that it was my mother who, when she heard my father saying this, would say to me that if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice will simply be a theoretical abstraction. Happily, in my mother, blessed memory, I had somebody who was the ultimate human rights advocate or peace activist, and that's where my inspiration came from.
And the apple didn't fall too far from the tree, Irwin. You helped defend and advocated for some people. Surely you took inspiration from Natan Sharansky, from Nelson Mandela, now from Jimmy Lai. How do the people that you help defend, how do they continue to inspire you and push you forward?
First, let me say that I guess due to my parents' teaching, and I had some wonderful teachers in high school. Among them was Irving Layton, the Canadian poet. Now, Irving Layton was in charge of the entire secular studies program at the Jewish day school that I was at. And that meant that he taught also physics and chemistry and math. To this day, I know nothing but physics and chemistry. He was a great poet, and I learned a lot about poetry and humanities. And he introduced me when I was very young to another person who came in inspiration for me when I was 14 years of age. He introduced me to Leonard Cohen, who also had been his student, and he would refer to both of us as his spiritual children. And Leonard Cohen and I were very, very close, as my wife knows, and I may share a story. I don't think I made this one public, but 2 weeks before Leonard Cohen passed, we were together with my grandson. He was about to celebrate his bar mitzvah, 13 years of age, and he came to me and he said, Grandfather, he said, I'm going to be doing the service, but I'm going to compose it to Leonard Cohen's songs. And I was really moved by this, and I wrote Leonard Cohen a note that I said, look, Leonard, our friendship has passed on to the third generation, to my grandson. And then I got a note back, which my wife still has to this day. He passed 2 weeks later. It was an incredible, moving note, and it ended with, in Hebrew, as he sent it to me, the priestly blessings. And so the connection between Irving Layton, Leonard Cohen, against the backdrop of my parents, and then wonderful teachers at the law school, that led me to get involved while I was still a law student in what I would call the two great human rights movements of the second half of the 20th century. That was the struggle for human rights in the then former Soviet Union and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And then when I became a law professor, to get involved with the two people who were the voice, the identity, the vision of those struggles. And that was, as you mentioned, Anatoly Sharansky, as he then was in the former Soviet Union, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And I want to say that in my involvement with those two, I then developed through their inspiration and through their tutorship, if I could put it that way, the action plans for defense of political prisoners that I still work on today and that we sought to, in fact, implement yesterday when we had the all-party parliamentary press conference on behalf of Jimmy Lai, the imprisoned Hong Kong democracy advocate, journalist, human rights embodiment, which is why he was imprisoned.
And let me add how much of a privilege it was to be in law school in the late 1980s, when Irwin, I had constitutional law when Irwin was freeing Anatoly, now Natan Sharansky, and then brought Sharansky to the law school and began a series of human rights lectures. Rosalie Abella was one of those inaugural lecturers, and Rosie's here tonight. You made it, you inspired us, Irwin, by doing what you were doing. And you inspired the whole faculty. I remember Professor Ron Sklar saying to us, you've got to go to Irwin's things. These are so critically important that you go, because he's putting his life into this. And so how could you not but be inspired by this? And the other thing, Irwin, that coincided with you teaching us was the beginning of the charter. The charter had come into force only a few years before. And so you were doing seminal work on Section 2 of the charter, for example, and you were incorporating that into our constitutional law lecture. And it was just a wonderful privilege to be inspired by you as you were living and working and advocating on the ground for the kinds of things that you were teaching us in the classroom. Critically important. You went on to political career. You left me. I came on as a colleague, and you left in 1999 to go into Parliament. You were an MP, and you became Minister of Justice, and you became Minister of Foreign Affairs. What were you particularly proud of in your time as Minister of Justice?
Well, one of the things I was particularly proud of are the people sitting right in front of me here. When I became Minister of Justice, shortly afterwards, two Supreme Court justices, both from Ontario, resigned. One was Louise Arbour, the other was Frank Iacobucci, both, exemplary justices on the Supreme Court. And so I had to then move to the two appointments. And Prime Minister Paul Martin, I have to say, and I say this publicly, I regard Paul Martin as one of the best prime ministers we never really had the opportunity to experience. I can tell you as somebody who worked with him, he really had the public good always at the forefront. And at the first cabinet meeting, said something that I never forgot. And it was a message to all of us there. He said, at the end of the day, he said, I believe we will be guided by one overriding principle and concern. And that is what we will do. At the time, that was the word for Aboriginal peoples. He said, that will be the test of our legacy. And he asked us, each of us, list of what our portfolios were, should make the issue of indigenous peoples a principle and priority in our respective priorities. When I developed what I called the 7 R's of Indigenous justice. But getting back to the two vacancies, at the time, there was no appointments process other than it was vested in the executive, mainly in our case with the Minister of Justice working with the Prime Minister. And Paul Martin delegated to me and filled the two positions. The first thing I did was to put in place a judicial appointments process that would involve bench, bar, academe, and the like, which has now been more formalized, because I felt it being vested solely in the executive or solely in the Minister of Justice was undue power for one person or for the executive branch. So we put in place a judicial appointment process, And as a result of that engagement with bench, bar, and academe, we then filled those two positions with Justices Louise Charon and with Justice Rosie Abella, who's sitting here this evening. Who I regard as a Renaissance world jurist, not only as an inspirational and exemplary jurist for Canada, but internationally. And wherever I go, whether it be the United States or Europe, etc., Rosie Abella is an iconic, inspirational jurist domestically and internationally. So Rosie, wonderful to have you. And the second is Justice Harry Laforme, who's here this evening, whom I had the pleasure, to be the person to appoint the first ever Indigenous person to be an appellate court judge in Canada. And I have to say that I found it disturbing that it was already 2004 and we had not yet appointed an Indigenous judge. And Harry, I'm lucky that it was able to be you, because you're a role model, not only for the ingenuity of justice, but also you're over. There's another judgment that Harry Laforme held down, which inspired me as well, and that was Harry was at the forefront with regard to same-sex marriage. And then when I became, as you mentioned, Minister of Justice and enacted the Civil Marriage Act, one of the principles and precedents was that which was set by Harry Laforme. So thank you for that, Harry.
Irwin, I won't let you forget your groundbreaking work on security with respect to the Jewish and Muslim communities, working to combat hatred and racism. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, and I was having a conversation with our Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, today, a wonderful exchange, and I mentioned to her, when I, again, as it happened, when I became Minister of Justice, not long afterwards, there was a firebombing of the Jewish day school that I had attended, and almost at the same time, the torching of a mosque in Toronto. And so I brought together the leadership of the Jewish and Muslim communities, and that sparked two other developments. One was the first ever national justice initiative against racism and hate, which for me was the underpinning really of what the building of a just society was all about, the protection of the most vulnerable amongst us. And at the same time, we established a Council on National Security at that time, headed, co-chaired by a Jew and a Muslim. I mentioned this, as I shared with Anita Anand today, because I'm concerned now that that kind of relationship that we had and that commonality of involvement and commitment and purpose has been eroding, and we need to bring this back. And I'm hoping we can. When you mentioned about the rising tide of anti-Semitism, this also, I had a discussion today with the head of CSIS about issues of racism and hate, and he brought it up as a matter of fact in our discussion. And I said to him, because the question he put to me is, how does the Jewish community feel? And I said, regrettably, they're feeling increasingly unsafe and insecure, and that the real issue is when I see that Jews feel that they have to compromise on their identity, that they take the mezuzah down from their residence, or they're afraid to wear a Jewish emblem. It's that sense really of where Canadians have to be apprehensive about affirming their identity and having almost necessarily to compromise on that I find concerning. But it isn't only in Canada, it's an unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism. We are seeing not only the highest level of anti-Semitic incidences since audits began in the 70s, but more disturbingly, the highest ever levels of anti-Semitic hate crimes and incendiary hate on the internet. And I mention that because those types of hate are community crimes. It's not just the individual target of a hate crime that feels it. It's the community that feels it. When you have a situation that Canadian Jewry is 1% of the population, but the target of 72% of religiously motivated hate crimes, then we have reached a disturbing plateau with respect to that. And again, as I've said in my discussions today with ministers or with parliamentarians, what concerns me, I say it in the historical sense and as well as in the contemporary sense, is that anti-Semitism is not just a threat to Jews, which it is. It is, as history has shown us, it's a threat to democracies, as my colleague Ahmed Shahid was the first UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion to issue a report on anti-Semitism for the UN, but he said it's toxic to democracies. It's an assault on our common humanity. And as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so anti-Semitism becomes the bloodied canary in the mine shaft of global evil. And we have to combat this anti-Semitism to defend and protect our democracies, as well as our minorities. And that's how I view the issue.
And here, I mean, Irwin, you're speaking from your current experience, and you were our special envoy in 2022 on anti-Semitism, but you're noting something that is so much markedly worse and you were also, let me put it this way, you were a Jew who grew up in Montreal, and there was always a latent degree of anti-Semitism in Montreal. McGill had Jewish quotas, and it was omnipresent. And yet, despite the fact that you lived through all of that, your parents lived through all of that, what you're seeing now is much worse.
No, this is very different. You know, my parents were very proud Canadians. They may have been subjected to the kind of what I would call genteel anti-Semitism, different from what we're experiencing now. And in the post-Holocaust, anti-Semitism was you know, at that point, clearly, popularly, and principally unacceptable. What disturbs me are two things. The first, as you mentioned, when I was special envoy on combating anti-Semitism, my first report at the end of 2021, after being in the position for 7 months, I said that my principal finding was, yes, we had to combat anti-Semitism, that paradigmatic approach of combating anti-Semitism from the far right, the far left, and radical Islam. I said it was no longer sufficient, that what I was witnessing and experiencing was what I referred to as the increasing mainstreaming, normalizing, legitimation of anti-Semitism, and the political culture, the popular culture, the sports culture, the entertainment culture, the media culture, and in particular, and most painfully, in the campus culture. And I said, regrettably, with an absence of outrage and accompanied by indifference and inaction. So the embers of anti-Semitism were burning before October 7th. And then the unspeakable mass atrocities of October 7th, which is the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, unspeakable mass atrocities. I remember it only too well because we were in Israel at the time on that fateful day on October 7th. My son had got married the week before, and we were going to go to the synagogue. It was a religious holiday, not only the Sabbath, but what's called Simchat Torah, the celebration of the receipt of the Bible and closing reading of the Bible. And we were going to go to the synagogue when that morning sirens went off, red alerts. I wasn't unaccustomed to that, but then we were told to go down to the bomb shelters, and then I had an experience that I'll never forget. And that was, I was sitting next to my granddaughter, who was also visiting us in Israel for my son's wedding. She's 9 years old, sitting next to me, and she was with her tablet, and she was uploading things on the tablet. The incredible thing about those unspeakable mass atrocities was that Hamas, the perpetrator of those atrocities, by the way, Hamas is not just a terrorist organization under Canadian law, that would be bad enough. It's an anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist, statelet, not because I say so, but because they proudly affirm it in their founding charter of 1988 and since. But what happened is that Hamas was not only perpetrating these unspeakable mass atrocities, brutalization and rape, I don't even want to mention, but they were uploading it and celebrating it on the media, on the social media. And my granddaughter was seeing this. And at one point she turned to me and said to me something that, you know, indelibly impacted itself in relation to your question, because she said, Grandfather, are we going to die? And, you know, this has always stayed with me. You know, we left Israel shortly after that, and what worries me about those unspeakable mass atrocities was that already on October 8th, we're already beginning to experience denial by some that the atrocities took place, or justification of them, or support for them, or even unbelievably celebration and glorification of them. And that's the thing that I find so disturbing, because it just metastasizes. And what we saw recently in the murder of the two Israeli diplomats in Washington, and then the terrorist attack in Boulder, Colorado, the people engaging in them actually did not feel any sense of remorse, but act as if they were justified in doing so. Because look, I want to say I understand what is happening in Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. I don't want for a moment to understate that, and terrible tragedies that are befalling the Palestinian people in Gaza. And the death of any innocent human being, Jew, Palestinian, is a tragedy. I want to make that very clear. But what happens when I hear the slogan, Free Palestine? I say, yes, free Palestine from Hamas. Because Hamas is not only holding Israelis hostage, they're holding the Palestinians in Gaza hostage. And what I found so disturbing is the kind of metastasizing of anti-Semitism, which, like Israel, like any other state, has to be responsible for any violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. And the Jewish people of Israel are not entitled to any special privilege or preference because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. But what we're witnessing now is something else. And the kind of metastasizing of the indictment of genocidaire of the entire Israeli people as being genocidal is giving license to many. There are many people who are genuinely concerned with what is happening in Gaza, and I understand that and I share that. But there are others for whom the instrumentalizing of the genocidal label is also being used to justify horrific anti-Semitic acts. So these are fundamental moral issues that we have to address, appreciate the distinctions, and do our best, you know, to stand on the right side of history. And standing on the right side of history, to me, it just means to close, to go back to my parents' initial lesson, pursue justice by combating injustice.
And let me just add, after breathing, that I'm speaking to someone who, as Minister of Justice and as Minister of Foreign Affairs, worked with both the ministers of justice of Israel and of the Palestinian Authority, and was honored by both Israel and the Palestinian Authority with medals of honor. And so, Irwin, thank you for that leadership. Irwin, let me talk about two other themes before we leave. One is the rise of authoritarianism. You have been one of the people that has spoken out so directly with respect to not just the former Soviet Union, Russia, but also the threat of Iran and China and their proxies. Ukraine obviously is one example, but tell us where your thinking is right there, right now.
Well, you know, you're right, David. 10 years ago, I spoke of what I call the global authoritarianism and the ongoing assault on human rights, the backsliding of democracies and political prisoners as a looking glass. I have to say that 10 years later, what is concerning me is that we're witnessing a concerted, intensifying, collaborative axis of authoritarianism involving, you know, Russia, China, and Iran, and the three of them mobilized in concert. And we have seen this, for example, with the unprovoked and premeditated Russian act of aggression in Ukraine, which was aided and abetted also by Iran and China. That's what I mean about the concerted axis of authoritarianism, and where we're in a situation now where, regrettably, the United States, that we used to look to as being the linchpin of the transnational alliance, or what we call the rules-based international order, is beginning at times even to upend that alliance and the rules-based order, which requires, I think, Canada to itself start to adopt a leadership position at this point. And now with the G7 coming up in a few days, we have an opportunity. And when I met with our Prime Minister before he became a Prime Minister and government ministers, I said, on the G7 agenda, I've been saying this, I said, put the issue of justice for Ukraine as a priority on that agenda, because we have an and that's why I'm delighted I'm part of a working group that's been working for 3 years now to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. Delighted on May the 9th, that decision was taken by the Council of Europe and Ukraine. We're moving forward on that. We have to move forward on repurposing of Russian assets, over $300 billion that can be used for reparations for Ukrainians. We have to protect against the deportation of Ukrainians. So justice for Ukraine is one. Second thing, I mentioned it again in discussion with ministers, if you ask somebody what's the greatest humanitarian catastrophe today, people will invariably answer Gaza. And as I mentioned, it is a serious humanitarian catastrophe. The greatest humanitarian catastrophe today, however, is Sudan. And Sudan is experiencing the second genocide. The Sudanese are suffering the second genocide of the 21st century, and it's just off the radar screen. And today, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights shared with the ministers, again, an action plan for accountability with regard to Sudan, for humanitarian assistance, for facilitating Sudanese immigrants. So Sudan is a second, Iran, very quickly, a sevenfold threat. It's nuclear, it's ballistic, it's terrorist, it's hegemonic, it's genocidal, it's cybersecurity, and in particular, massive domestic repression. We must stand in solidarity with the Iranian people, and that is and that, along with the issues that I mentioned before, combating racism, hate, discrimination, anti-Semitism, etc. These compose what I would like to see the priorities on the G7 agenda. I'm glad that the Prime Minister invited President Zelensky. I'm glad that he's expanded that and invited other leaders. I represented our Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, at the meeting in Israel recently, which was on anti-Semitism. And I closed off the conference by saying two things. One, because I had 2 minutes, and I said very quickly, number one, I'm not going to say anything here about the unprecedented explosion of anti-Semitism. I said, you've heard enough about it. I'll say just two things. One, which I had said earlier, that anti-Semitism is a threat to democracies. Two, I asked the G7 countries, put it on the G7 agenda, because if we are taking it seriously, we should put it on the agenda and we should act on it.
Thank you, Irwin. It leaves me to thank you. You in teaching us, you would often say, and I've forgotten the origin of the quote, I believe it's from the Dreyfus Affair, qui s'excuse, s'accuse. And you never have excused yourself, Irwin, from any fight or quest or move to defend human rights. You have lived that maximum, and I hope that all of us in this room will take up your fights, other fights, and not back away. Il faut jamais s'excuser, parce que il faut continuer à promouvoir la justice et à combattre l'injustice. Irwin, you have exemplified that in your life, in your work, and we thank you.